Good morning. Today I wanted to do a quick book review of a book I just finished, which is Shift by Hugh Howey. This is number 2 in the Silo series. And as I do this book review, I'd like to do it from an author's perspective and also a novelist's perspective. I like this book. I had a good time reading it. It had a good emotional impact throughout the book, and also in linking it to Wool, which I read a while ago, and this made me want to go back and kind of refresh my memory on some things in Wool. So I have had these books on my shelf for a long time. I just had never gotten around to reading them, and it wasn't until the Apple TV show came out for Silo that, like a lot of shows, I'll you know watch the first 2 episodes, really get into it, and then end up reading the book and tearing through the whole series. My camera is about to fall off. There we go. And in this case, it kind of ruined the series for me. um, Wool is, I could probably talk about Wool again. I need to reread it, I think, to refresh my memory. But that book has so many reversals in it. And my understanding is that it was written as novellas that were then, put together when Howie published it on Amazon. And Shift has kind of the same structure, but Wool is, in a lot of ways, I didn't expect to like this book because it kind of felt like Fallout fan fiction. And if you've played the game Fallout, it's a post-apocalyptic game that imagines a future as if we were still, like, the 1950s had been projected into the 2070s. And so everything's, hyper patriotic. The 50s, like the aesthetic of the 50s is still there. When you get into the Wool, the TV show, like they use kind of similar aesthetics. Like, you're in the bunker or the silo, and everything has this worn, old look to it. While there definitely is computer technology, it sort of has an older style to it. And that's very much in the theme of Fallout. And so one of the tropes of Fallout is that everybody lives in bunkers, or fallout shelters, and they were all created by a company called Vault-Tec. And Vault-Tec ran experiments on people. And so there were in each different vault, there was a different experiment that was being run. And as you explore the vaults in the game, you oftentimes learn through environmental cues or reading terminals or things like that, what the experiment was. And that will give you clues in how to solve the mystery of any given vault. So I went into Wool, like, thinking about this a lot, and, what it would really be like for people to live in a thing that is essentially a skyscraper underground. And the thing that I was thinking about a lot is, like, Jay Lake had this concept that he liked to call, I think it was like the linchpin theory. Linchpin, I'm pretty sure, was the word he used. But basically, you could come up with a fantasy world, and you could typically have, or I think he called it the mainspring. Like, he had a series that was about the mainspring. But you could, had to let my cat in. He was whining a little bit, and he's still wanting to get my attention. So the idea of the mainspring in a story is that you can have a world with a fantastical idea. You just need to get the reader to buy into the mainspring idea. And as long as they do that, they'll pretty much go with you. You just have to be careful not to do too many things that will, burst the bubble of believability. And if you can get somebody to believe in that one fantastical idea, you can put other fantastical ideas on top of that. But if you're trying to be somewhat realistic, like somewhat science fictional, as opposed to just straight up fantasy, you really have to be careful with that. And so the Silo series is always sort of balancing that line of, would people really be willing to live in this environment? And how would they make that happen? And that's where Howie really, I think these books shine because he's focusing just so much on the human aspect of what it would take to exist here and what questions people would ask or not ask, like what would people buy into or not buy into, what is human striving if you take away, all hope for people, and what if you try to create mechanisms in society to basically destroy people's desire to ask questions and to know what's outside, to know what's beyond like the stars or, you know, everything that we do science wise. Like these people have had to stop doing that, and they have controls in their lives, basically a pact that they agree not to do these parts of their humanity so they can live in the silo and continue living there. And if you disobey the pact, you're going to have to go do a cleaning, which means you put on a suit and you go outside, and nobody knows what the evil thing is that's outside. They just know that it destroyed the world. Well, Wool is Huey. Basically, it's third person. I don't quite want to call it close, but it moves among characters. You do get inside their minds, but one of the strengths of this book is I think Huey doesn't spend a lot of time deep inside a character. Like, you're definitely getting their emotions, but these are very much plot-driven books. And in Wool, you are basically introduced to the world through one character, and then you start really experiencing the process of all this through another character, Juliet, and the things that she does, which kind of basically turns the whole premise upside down as you discover more about the world. Well, Shift is book 2 in a trilogy, and a book 2 can always be a challenge because you want to build on what was created in book 1 and not be repetitive about what was happening. But a lot of times, like, book 1 will be a certain scope of what the story was, and then book 2 will expand that scope. And if you're setting up the expectation in the reader that there's always going to be these sort of revelations, the challenge there is that Howey is withholding information from people, and in this case, or from the reader. And in this case, you're doing it through the character who just doesn't know what's out there. But now we've moved to characters that do know, for the most part, what's happening, because it doesn't start in our time. It starts in 2070. And that's part of the mainspring challenge with Shift, is that there are certain things you need to accept have not changed about the world in 2070. And these books were written back in, I think it was 2010, 2012. We already know that those things have changed drastically. AI does exist in this world, but he never calls it that. It's basically just the server and how the servers are moved, the computers are controlling things, but the people don't interact with them the way that we do and probably will interact more and more with them. And also people's expectations about technology. There's a revelation, and I should have said from up front, there are going to be spoilers in this review. Nanite technology exists, and it's life-extending technology, but the conceit there is that the same technology that can extend life can also basically just, disintegrate people, like the whole sort of gray goo trope that, everybody worries about in a world where nanites can build anything. It could also disassemble anything and just, turn us all into goo. Well, that is the main threat in this world. And something similar happens to actually what happens in the Fallout TV show universe, which is, it's hinted at heavily in the game, but basically Vault-Tec, the company, engineers the nuclear war that leads people to have to live in the vaults. And in this case, I have to go back and look closely at the text. I don't think it's straight up said that the US government, bombed Georgia so that they could get people into the vaults or into the silos, but there definitely a nuclear war happens, or a nuclear attack happens, and it pushes this number of people into the vault, into the silos. Certain things kind of get glossed over, like how long it would take to get all those people in there. There's also cryogenic technology that certain people that it's hinted at or suggested that they've had the nanite life-extending treatment are also now in deep freeze. But Howey that's not what this story is about. He's more focused on what happens to humans when they're following a set of rules that you forget what the originating reason for the rules are, and you keep going. So it's kind of a Milgram, prison experiment with people enacting out a set of rules to maintain what happens, maintain their lives. And are they still human if they do that? The conceit of the book is also pretty similar to some other science fiction books that are out there. Cryogenic storage opens up this idea of time travel, that you can never go back in time, but we can freeze you for 1,000 years and you will functionally have time traveled forward, right? So Wayward Pines is a book that did this. Spoiler alert, although you figure that out pretty fast that happened. In Peter Hamilton's Commonwealth series, they have wormhole technology, and in one part of the book, they're trying to protect whole planets from alien invasion, and so they basically move people into a wormhole and just keep them there in stasis for hundreds of years. And so that is pretty wild. So it's not a new idea in science fiction, and Huey isn't, concerned. I keep saying Huey. Hugh Howey. Howey is not concerned with a lot of the other ramifications of this. And also people don't necessarily know about it, or the information hasn't gotten out. And I can mostly believe that would happen, but it's an underpinning that the whole time you're kind of thinking, well, why don't more people know about this? They're also taking drugs that affect their memory, and that's a big part of it. They're all being drugged. So that's kind of the world building problem that is happening with the book. This book is also similar to another series that I like a lot, which is Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky. And that is a book that follows basically uplifted, you're going to hate this, but uplifted spiders and what happens to them across time as he follows their evolution. And so it's a book that makes a lot of big time jumps. And in that case, he's sort of working with archetypes of the spiders, because there are sort of different, not species of, but types of spiders within the jumping spider species that he follows. So you're always kind of following a Portia as they move forward, but not the same Portia. Well, in this case, you are following the same characters, but he does some playing with identity, because they wake up thinking that they're different people, and they don't, names have been removed, so identity has been removed. They're just people fulfilling functions. And as they start to remember more, or in some cases, the memory drugs don't work, they start to question their identity. And so there's a lot of playing with how much information the reader is going to get. This also reminded me heavily of another series, Jeff Vandermeer's Area X, where you basically have an unknowable, what could be an alien thing that starts affecting a natural area, in this case in Florida, and the government is trying to control it. And it's a thing that the government can't control, but they're trying to, contain it with bureaucracy. And Vandermeer spends a lot of time in the minds of the director of the facility and other characters, trying to make bureaucracy work to control the thing. And ultimately, it's kind of about how that won't work. And Shift is sort of like that in similar ways. Shift is not as much of a, Vandermeer is very interested in doing weird fiction and goes off in all these sort of, literary descriptive directions to disorient you and show you things that are confusing or you really have to think about and make sense of. Whereas Howey is a very direct writer. This book, one of the real strengths of the book is that it moves quickly through its points that it's going to do. Because if I had come off this book directly from Wool, I probably would have been disappointed that I wasn't continuing Juliet's story. I moved to a different story, but I'm still it's being driven by the curiosity of what created the silos. And I think that's enough to pull a reader through. But the structure of the book is also such that they're very short chapters. They're very much driven by the action in the chapter. And then he really won't ride a chapter all the way through. There might be, it moves up to some mystery or some action by the character, and then he'll do a chapter break. And in some other books, you might have jumped from there to another character, and that can create I think, a sense of frustration. Like, as the longer I write, the more I kind of like to ride a thing all the way through for a character. Like, you still need to end a chapter on some form of tension to keep pulling people through it. But it does get a little irritating, to me at least, to jump around constantly with characters. He doesn't do that, but he'll do a chapter break in the middle of some sort of major action thing that's happening. I've heard arguments about that either way, if you should do that or shouldn't do that. Like, if you give people a reason to stop, they will stop. But for me, especially because I was kind of jumping back and forth between listening to the book and reading the book, like, it pulled me through. But I think that's something to think about. But they are short chapters. There were 100 chapters in this book for a relatively short book. But it moves fast. And so while it's not following the characters that people were probably invested in, you do get invested in and follow the characters in this one. But now that I'm finished with it, it becomes pretty clear that, like, this included, 2 novellas that were, I think when it originally came out, it was more in the form of novellas. Because there's a middle section that, while it's compelling, doesn't, like, it ultimately just gives kind of background information on the whole story. It doesn't really propel this story that much forward. And then you move from that story on a character who basically kind of accepts his fate to another character who's caught up in a vault collapse, Jimmy, who you met previously in Wool, who has to go through the collapse of the silo and everything that happens there. And I think the lesson from his story is that if you don't know what to do with a character, or you want a character to be sympathetic while they kind of are doing terrible things for their own survival, give them an animal. Up until to that point, like, I couldn't remember cats being mentioned, or really a lot of animals being mentioned in the series. And then basically Jimmy finds a cat, and the cat saves him, and then unfortunately, like a lot of the tension in this whole series, like, you're just thinking the whole time, like, how are these people going to die? Unfortunately, that all of this is just terrible and they're going to die. But now there's a cat, and I really don't want the cat to die, but I also know that Jimmy, when we meet Jimmy, he's much older and he didn't have a cat. So I'm going to have to live life with the cat. And I love cats. I love animals. So it's like giving someone a dog. And then, I just lost my dog recently. And so maybe I'm extra sensitive to that. But having lived a whole life with my dog and having lost him, like, I'm just extra sensitive to that. And it feels a little cheap to me, but I think as an author, that's a thing you can do. That's just sort of an easy button on evoking emotion in something, especially in what's going to be essentially kind of an action survival sequence where, he's terrified a lot of the time, or there's just this sense of dread. And the problem here is that, Jimmy lives. So anything that happens in between those points is basically just torturing Jimmy until the point when Juliet meets him. So the driving force behind this book is giving the reader more information about the world and why the world is the way it is. And so to do that, Howey has to withhold information from the characters. And there's sort of a mystery of how, the main character learns what happened and sort of how the vaults work, although there's still information being withheld about how the vaults work. And in scenes, the characters see schematics, they see certain things about how the vaults are laid out, but then some other piece of it will be revealed. And that does get kind of frustrating. Like, we live in a world where there are still servers. A lot of things are on paper. They've thought through putting a lot of things in books. But at this point, we are hundreds of years in the future. Like, we've moved from 2070 to 2345 by the time the book ends. And so they're still, like, they've gone through several cycles of needing to be able to repair things, of paper books probably not holding together if they're exposed to the air, or at least under very specific conditions. So I found that mainspring starting to kind of unwind for me on a number of those details. But the thing is, like, you just don't care. Like, this is also a good example of emotion, and you get invested in the characters, whether you're really deep in their minds or not. They're doing actions that make them sympathetic because they're being good people. And I think that's the driving force behind Donnie the main character is that he is fundamentally a good person trying to do the right thing, and he's been manipulated his whole life. Like, it ultimately you get, that information, and he's pretty frustrated about that, as you would expect. But it's the mystery that pulls you through that. While he does do kind of what I felt was a pretty heinous thing, you can also understand why he did that. I probably wouldn't have had him do that, but also the character that he did it to, I think might have been, I don't know that Howie knew what to do with her afterwards, if he had kept her around. So that could be part of that problem. Like, but also, there are two main. So Thurman and Anna, I guess I already said there'd be spoilers, so it doesn't really matter there. But Thurman is the congressman who's kind of manipulated this whole thing, and then his daughter, who it turns out has been manipulating Donnie because she loves him apparently. But I'm at a point in my life where I know that if you love someone, you don't manipulate them into doing terrible things and take away their family, right? That's not love. That's not loving someone. So these characters don't necessarily evolve past that point. But also, when these characters are killed, you remove any opportunity for them to reveal the real mystery behind what's happening. So you're going to then have to figure out the mystery from all the various schematics and other documents that have been left around. So that's pretty frustrating. Like, don't kill the people that know the answers. But that's not the kind of story this is, right? And characters aren't perfect. Donnie is not perfect. He has a right to be angry because he's been manipulated for, 300 years. But that's the challenge that Howie is dealing with, like how to maintain the energy of this mystery across 3 books, especially with books that move as fast as they do. Wool sets up this expectation that there will be reveals all the time. And so, I didn't look at like how consistently they come, but Shift, I'm sorry, is kind of doing the same thing. Like a certain number of reveals are coming through the story that pull people through it. So of course you reach the end of the book and it's looped, like timelines have lined up. I would say that probably the biggest challenge, especially with listening to it, because I wasn't seeing a lot of the dates that were on chapter markers, was that there were non-concurrent timelines happening in the book. And so once you figure out how those are taking place, it makes more sense. But for a while you're thinking to yourself, like, how is this coming together? How is this working? And that's also part of the challenge. If you weren't reading this quickly and you were kind of taking a break, a lot of the times I could see that getting confusing. So as a writer, that's going to be a challenge. Like if you're not leading a person through a linear story, you really, I think, have to put some effort into making sure the reader understands where those timelines are. But overall, like while the reader is pulled through by the plot, there's still some really good emotional beats. And like I said, the cat, so it really pulled me through. And I would absolutely recommend this book in looking at, nonlinear timelines, a middle book that moves away from the first book in a series, but still gives concurrent information while things are happening. And then also characters who have shifting identity throughout the story and how, how he ties that into everything. Like one of the things you start to realize is he doesn't do it a ton. He's not punning a lot, but he does like to play with different like meanings of words. So, shift as in a shift in perspective versus shift as in working a shift, revolution as in, changing of the government versus a thing coming around to the same place over and over again. He brings those up pretty explicitly in the story, but it gets you back to the theme of, what is humanity and what are we striving toward and what is the real meaning of like, okay, it almost doesn't even matter why the silos are there. It's how people are dealing with it once it exists. And so without having read the 3rd book, and I'll do a review on that one once I get to it. To me, the biggest tragedy of this might ultimately be that all these people have just been stuck in some kind of nature preserve that was cordoned off because somebody set off nuclear bombs there, and the rest of the world has been continuing on as they live here in some kind of preserve. That would be super tragic. But it might also get back to the theme, right? Which is like, does it really matter? And the mission character in the middle of this like goes through all this striving of thinking he's going to bring about a revolution or get back to the way things used to be, when ultimately his story ends with loving and marrying the girl who has loved him all along, and they just find out they're about to have a baby. And is that what ultimately matters? So I definitely recommend this book. I think as an author, there's a lot to be seen here. Why was this book as successful as it was? That is a kind of deeper question. Like, these books came out and hit Amazon right at the time when the Kindle store was first starting, and it was very hungry for content. And they maintained a ranking on Kindle for a long time on the Amazon store. And so they're the kind of books that once a publisher picked them up, and they've just continued to have energy. And now that there's a pretty good Apple TV show, while the show made decisions that, I felt really slowed things down and maybe not want to continue watching it, it did lead me back to the book. And, Hugh Howey made some money from me there with the books. So I'd say they're definitely good timeless stories in that sense. But if you played Fallout, you're probably just going to think this is Fallout fan fiction. This was the Vault-Tec backstory that we all love to see even now in the Fallout TV show that's coming out, right? So anyway, thanks for hanging out with me. Again, this was about Shift by Hugh Howey, which is book number 2 in the Silo series.